Sorry, I find it difficult to talk with an open door behind me. I keep imagining somebody's going to spring out and say something embarrassing. Good afternoon, everybody. I wish that you were all in my classes, because you settle to quietness as soon as I come towards the front, and my students certainly don't. I'm Peter Holland. I'm the Associate Dean for the Arts in the College of Arts and Letters, and one of my jobs in the office is to organise every year the cycle of Saturday Scholars. Here we are at the end of another semester. Those of you who have been to earlier ones will tell me afterwards whether it's been as good, as bad, or whatever as previous years, but I've enjoyed it enormously, and we've saved an extremely good, I was going to say the best to last, but that wouldn't be fair on the other lecturers, but we've saved an extremely interesting topic for our last paper. John Duffy is the Francis O'Malley Director of the University Writing Programme. He teaches and helps to teach our students to understand how to write well, or as one student said after going to the writing centre, he taught me to write good. You can't win them all. The work of the Writing Centre is of enormous importance for the work of our students, and to enable them genuinely to hone their critical skills, to develop arguments, and to know what it means to argue a case, which of course connects very much with his concerns today. He's published widely on the ethics of writing, on the rhetoric of disability, and the historical development of rhetoric in cross-cultural contexts. His book, Writing from These Roots, which is about the development of literacy in a Hmong American community, was published in 2007 and won the 2009 Outstanding Book Award by the Conference on College Composition and Communication. Here at Notre Dame, he's also received an NEH, National Endowment for Humanities Fellowship, and strikingly, I think, in terms of his concern with students, a Reverend Joyce Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching, one of the most valued awards in our community. He teaches courses in rhetoric and writing and literature, and he's co-edited a book just out December last year called Literacy, Economy and Power, Writing and Research, after Deborah Brandt's book, Literacy in American Lives. His topic today is Beyond Civility, addressing the crisis in American public discourse. Please welcome John Duffy. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank you, Peter, for that introduction. There's a conviction among Notre Dame faculty that Peter Holland could read the phone book and most of us would listen entranced. Before I begin, I want to just say a few very brief introductory remarks, make a few. First is that anything I may say about civility or any recommendations that I might make about how to speak and write with one another do not take effect until after the Louisville game, okay? So we are free till then. May I ask you, how many of you have been to one of these talks before, previously? Oh, lots of you. Okay, so I'm the newbie here, I'm the rookie. This is my first one. And how many of you, if any of you, are from out of state? Anybody from Kentucky? Okay, you're welcome. All right. Can you hear me all right? All right. I'm from New York City. I've been at Notre Dame for 16 years now. I came with the intention of staying maybe 1 or 2 years, but as my family and I are wont to say, we somewhere along the way drank the Notre Dame Kool-Aid, and 16 years have gone by. In all of that time, I have been associated with the University Writing Program, which I now direct. And in that program, as Peter explained, we teach students introductory principles of academic argument. We focus on argument because it's the currency of the university. In the liberal arts, virtually every course involves making or analyzing arguments. But we also focus on argument because we have the conviction that what we teach to students in the first year writing course is, if not identical to, is at least it corresponds with the kinds of rhetorical practices that they will engage in, and we hope carry forward when they go into their communities beyond Notre Dame. That is, we hold out the idea that the students who come here will someday be in some positions of influence, whether that's in business or in academia or in government or in nonprofit agencies or whatever it may be. And we want to introduce in those classes, those first-year writing classes, the kinds of rhetorical practices that we think that they will be able to use down the road. And so that means for me that I've spent a lot of time thinking about what is happening beyond Notre Dame, beyond the bubble, as we say. What kinds of rhetoric is being practiced outside of the university? And that's really the subject of my talk today, is public discourse and its condition. So the way I want to do this, I want to frame this in terms of 4 questions, okay? And I'm going to give you the answers to the questions right now so that if you have to leave or if it's really sunny out and you want to get outside. So the first question is, our public discourse, is it really as bad as it seems? And my answer to that question is yes. In fact, it's worse. And I'll try to explain why. The second question is, if it's as bad as all that, how did it get that way? And there are a lot of reasons. If you read a dozen books on this, you'll get a dozen responses. I'm going to offer 3 very briefly, and those are political causes, economic causes, and technological causes. The third question is, what difference does it make? So there's lots of people saying lots of outrageous things. There's lots of rhetorical spectacles going on outside of us and around us. Does that make any difference? Isn't that the price we pay for a robust democracy? And isn't that a consequence of our free speech? And aren't efforts to moderate or regulate public discourse, don't they push us ever so inevitably and dangerously toward that dreaded concept of political correctness? And my answer to that will be yes and no. Yes, it does matter. Yes, there are consequences. And no, all that other stuff I said is wrong. Okay. And then the final question, and I hope I have time to get through all those. The final question will be, given everything I've just said, is there anything that we can do about this? Is there anything that we should do about this? And my answer to that question will be yes, there is. And the first thing that I believe that we should do is to stop talking about civility. Civility is the wrong metric. Now, that sounds paradoxical, and I say it at the beginning in hopes that it will interest you enough that you'll stay till the end. So that's the plan. So I have some clips, some tapes I've made, which I think will be fun to watch, and we'll look at those if I can figure out how to correctly do them, put them up. So let's begin. Is our public discourse really as bad as it seems? To address that question, I'd like to read something to you. It's an everyday moment in American political discourse. On May 26, 2012, Jay Townsend, a campaign spokesperson for Congressman Nan Hayworth, joined an online discussion on a Facebook page titled, ironically enough, given the exchange that followed, the 19 U.S. House of Representatives Civil Discussion Center. Now, what was taking place that day was a discussion of equal pay legislation that was before Congress, whether or not women senators should be paid, women should be paid the same as men in equal positions. And this debate was going on online, and Jay Townsend, who was a campaign spokesperson for Hayworth, one of the candidates, was in this discussion. And in the course of this argument that was going back and forth, he was responding to a constituent who identified himself as Tom. And this is what Townsend wrote. Quote, "Listen to Tom. What a little bee he has in his bonnet. Buzz, buzz. My question today, when is Tommy Boy going to weigh in on all the Lilly Ledbetter hypocrites who claim to be fighting the war on women? Let's hurl some acid at those female Democratic senators who won't abide the mandates they want to impose on the private sector." Now, there was a scandal. Townsend resigned. And in fairness to Mr. Townsend, I think we all say things that we'd like to take back. We all make comments in the heat of emotion that, we think probably that wasn't a very good idea. And that's what he said, and he resigned, and the election went on. But that comment was shocking on two levels. One was the actual content of what he said. Acid attacks on women have been documented in 20 countries worldwide, and 40% of the victims are women under 18. So that was an absolutely grotesque thing to say. But the other shocking part, at least to me, was how routine this kind of language is in American public discourse. It's not as though that was unusual. With each passing news cycle, there are fresh reports of the misinformation, demonization, incendiary metaphors, and poisonous historical analogies that characterize contemporary public argument. Cable television, talk radio, and countless portals on the internet have made toxic rhetoric a fact of everyday life, a form of entertainment, and a product to be marketed and sold. Such rhetoric has managed to undermine discourses grounded in rational argument and logical proofs, which were formerly considered authoritative. Instead, we are awash in shouting matches, misrepresentation, Nazi metaphors, and personal attacks. And so now I'm going to show you a few examples that I pulled off the internet. They're kind of random. This is about 4 or 5 minutes of tape, and I'll be stopping it and starting it. It took me about 4 days to do this, which proves that English professors shouldn't be allowed near new technology. At least this professor shouldn't. I could put my eye out with this stuff. All right, so see if we can figure out how to work this.
There are also those who claim that our reform efforts would ensure illegal immigrants.
Not what we want.
This, too, is false. The reforms I'm proposing would not apply to those who are here illegally.
And in case you do get sick, if you get sick in America, this is what the Republicans want you to do. If you get sick, America, the Republican health care plan is this. Die quickly. That's right.
Probably one of the worst times that we've seen because of the numbers of people who were elected to Congress. I went through this as co-chair of the Arts Caucus. In '94, people were elected simply to come here to kill the National Endowment for the Arts. Now they're here to kill women.
Obama.
Our opponent is someone who sees America as imperfect enough to pal around with terrorists who targeted their own country.
There was about 78 to 81 members of the Democrat Party that are members of the Congress Party.
Now you have the Republicans who want to literally drag us all the way back to Jim Crow laws.
And they don't like the truth, so they summarily dismiss it. They say it's a government takeover of health care, a big lie, just like Goebbels. You say it enough, you repeat the lie, you repeat the lie, you repeat the lie, and eventually people believe it. Like blood libel. That's the same kind of thing. The Germans said enough about the Jews, and the people believed it, and you had the Holocaust.
Again, total power in one person's hands, not the American way. These damn bills that come out here all the damn time, come out here the last second, and I gotta try to figure out how to vote for my people. Now I'm ashamed of you. You should be ashamed of yourself.
Okay. We'll get to him. Those are our politicians. These are the people that we are electing to represent us, to help guide us through the crisis of energy, the crisis of national security, the crisis of immigration. These are the people, the grown-ups, that we are sending to Congress and to the people that we want to practice our politics. So it's not a good start, is it? But what about our punditry? Okay, if we can't rely on our politicians to give us grown-up responses to practical questions, can we rely on our media? Some of you may remember, I'm guessing, that there was a time when most Americans trusted Walter Cronkite. When he spoke, we listened. Or David Brinkley. Or there was a time when many people thought the New York Times was the paper of record and not a liberal rag. Now, I don't want to suggest that there was ever a golden age. There wasn't, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But can we turn to the media for insights, for wisdom, for maturity in addressing these problems. Let's sample.
This advice, Mr. Bush,
himself as a
shut
guy over
the
and over
hell
and over again who
up.
has a deep-seated hatred for white people or the white culture. I don't know what it is. You can't say he doesn't like white people. David Axelrod's white. Rahm Emanuel's his chief of staff of white.
Which reminds me, while we were off, Sarah Palin agreed to do commentary at Fox News, which is actually very similar to her day job, talking to a baby with Down syndrome.
President Obama is going to be visiting Joplin, Missouri on Sunday. But you know what they're talking about? Like this right-wing slut, what's her name, Laura Ingraham? Yeah, she's a talk slut.
What does it say about the college co-ed Susan Fluke, who goes before a congressional committee and essentially says that she must be paid to have sex? What does that make her? It makes her a slut, right? Makes her a prostitute. She wants to be paid to have sex.
The more illegal aliens. Illegal aliens commit crimes at a lower rate than citizens do.
This guy shouldn't have been here.
Cool your jets. It has nothing to do with illegal aliens. It has to do with drunk driving. Don't obscure a tragedy to make a cheap political point.
I'm the father.
It is a cheap political point.
No, it isn't.
And you know
this
it.
is justice.
This has nothing to do with that poor old lady mayor.
You
it
want
has nothing to do with that mayor.
You want anarchy.
No, what
you
I
want open border anarchy.
What I want is fairness. We have lured these people. We have lured these people. We have lured these people to this country with a promise of job in a country where there is basically full domestic employment. We have for
Okay, we'll get to him too. Okay, so we can't look to our politicians for the kind of maturity we need rhetorically. We can't really rely on our popular media, but at least we have the option, and I think you kind of know where I'm going to go with this, of escaping these things from time to time through our entertainment industry. Our actors, our singers, our broadcasters, they let us kind of get away and enjoy ourselves.
But I have obviously failed to galvanize and prod, if not shame, enough Americans to be ever vigilant not to let a Chicago communist-raised, communist-educated, communist-nurtured, subhuman mongrel like the Acorn community organizer gangster Barack Hussein Obama to weasel his way into the top office of authority in the United States of America.
And all week, the only thing people keep asking is, what are you going to say? Do you know what you're going to say? And as usual, I didn't plan anything, but I thought I'd say something brand new and just say, just so you know, we're ashamed the President of the United States is from Texas.
Unless that spending is on them and benefits them. I mean, the level of hypocrisy from the Republican Party, to me, hypocrisy is what defines the Republican.
You mean when John Boehner played golf with President Obama?
Oh, yeah, and Biden and Kasich, yeah, uh-huh.
What did you not like about it? It seems to be a really pivotal moment for you.
Come on. It'd be like Hitler playing golf with Netanyahu, okay?
Okay.
Not
as the standoffs in Wisconsin.
Okay. So, that's spectacle, right? And we may find it amusing, we may find it offensive, we may find it irrelevant to us. That is the spectacle. And by the way, I should say two things. One, I hope you're appreciating how even-handed I'm trying to be in presenting these clips. I worked hard at that. The second thing I want to say is that we shouldn't let ourselves off the hook by laughing at the rich and the powerful and their rhetorical excesses, because the rest of us aren't any better. If you go to the comments section of virtually any website and scroll down, you'll find enough ad hominem, enough inflammatory attacks, enough irrationality, and enough implied violence to last you a long time. But getting back to spectacle, that's not the greatest problem that we face in our public discourse, as lurid as it is. I mean, that's what attracts the most attention from the media, and that's probably half the time why those things get said. It's a competitive market, and people need to attract attention to themselves. But what is, in my view, more dangerous, more disturbing, is that we seem to have reached a point in our public deliberation in which there is no widely shared agreement as to the nature of a fact or what counts as evidence. There is little place in our public arguments for deliberative language that might express doubt, explore ambiguities, admit error, or acknowledge positions that depart from partisan orthodoxy. The result is arguments that are reduced to assertions and counter-assertions, claims and counterclaims, and many of those that are expressed in language that is angry, fearful, and closed to the possibilities of mutual understanding. Now, on the poster advertising this talk, I referenced a crisis in public discourse. And I go back and forth with that phrase. Sometimes I think it's a little overblown, a little overdramatic. But I come back at times and I ask myself, if it isn't a crisis, what is it when questions of science are argued in terms of ideology? When empirical evidence is rejected because it doesn't conform to one's worldviews, or when factual data is rejected on or accepted on the basis of political utility. If that's not a crisis, it's something near it, and it's certainly not healthy, and it doesn't bode well for the Republic. So, that brings me to the second question. What are the causes? As I say, there are many causes. When I teach argument in my classes and we talk about causal arguments, I advise my students to be cautious. If it seems obvious, it isn't. If it seems definite, it's probably something else. So we approach causal arguments, I think, best with some humility as to understanding complex phenomena. But I'll just give you three possibilities. One is political, and that is we don't vote. We are responsible in large part for the discourse that we have. In the last election, the turnout rate, the midterm election, the turnout rate was 36.4%. That was the lowest participating rate of eligible voters, according to the Washington Post, since 1942. In Indiana, it was just 28%. And that was a landslide compared to the primary. Here in St. Joe County, where I live, the turnout for the primaries leading up to the midterms was 7%. 93% of the people weren't interested enough. And what does that mean? Well, it means that when few people vote, that elections are dominated by the angriest, the most partisan, the most motivated people. And those people attract the most funding from unregulated special interests. Moderation disappears, public rhetoric becomes more strident, and voter apathy rises. The second reason I would suggest is economic. We've all witnessed in the past 10 to 15 years the proliferation of new media platforms for political rhetoric, cable television, talk radio, and so forth. These platforms, these properties, are very, very lucrative. They make a lot of money. And I'm not talking about individuals who get rich. You know, some of the people who host these shows become fabulously wealthy. But I'm not talking about them. I'm talking more about the corporations that own these properties. There are rational business reasons, rational economic reasons for maintaining this kind of programming and this type of discourse. And that means that there are powerful disincentives to change, powerful economic disincentives to changing it. The third leg of the stool, I would say, is technological. Our public discourse today isn't really that much worse than it was, say, 100 years ago. In the presidential campaign of 1828, when Andrew Jackson ran against John Quincy Adams, Jackson was accused of murder, gambling, adultery, slave trading, and treason. For good measure, Jackson's mother was called a prostitute, and his wife Rachel was called a bigamist. So there's nothing new about vilification. But what makes our moment extraordinary is not the fact of our corrosive discourse, rather it's the technologies that allow us to disseminate the discourse so effectively. Andrew Jackson may have been called a murderer and a slave trader, but the charges against him were not broadcast 24 hours a day on Fox News or MSNBC. Jackson's mother may have been slandered as a prostitute, but Nancy Grace did not devote dozens of hours of programming to examining that charge. And Jackson's wife, Rachel, did not have the allegations of bigamy made against her circulated on Facebook, and her love affairs were not tweeted to tens of thousands of followers. So we're unique not because of the toxic nature of our rhetoric, but because of the methods we have for delivering the toxins. That's what makes the rhetoric today more profoundly effective and more consequential, perhaps, than at any time previously in American history. Which brings us to the next question. What difference does it make? So there are people who are out there making all kinds of wild charges and saying all kinds of, excuse me, all kinds of terrible things. Isn't that just, as I said earlier, the price of a robust democracy? And are we tampering with free speech? Is there any consequence to all of this? Excuse me. We might say it doesn't really matter. Now, if I said that, I'd be in the minority among Americans. Surveys of public attitudes indicate a widespread pessimism regarding the state of public discourse. A 2013 study by the public relations firm Weber Shandwick found that approximately 2/3 of Americans believe the nation faces a major civility problem. That 7 in 10 believe incivility is worse today than it was in the past, and more than 8 in 10 believe incivility is leading to an increase in violence. More, our public discourse seems to be driving us away from one another, literally. According to Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort, Americans have been sorting themselves out into alarmingly homogeneous communities, choosing to live in cities and even neighborhoods where neighbors share political, cultural, and religious values. So not only are we losing the ability to talk across our differences, we are choosing to live in places where this may not even be possible. And the problem with that, of course, is that the complex problems that we face, whether of energy or national security or immigration or the economy, we will never achieve universal acclamation as to how to address these problems. In a nation as diverse and complex as our own, we are always going to have to settle for some form of reasoned compromise. And that is the very thing that is so disdained in our public rhetoric. Now, all of the things I've just said can't be blamed entirely on corrosive public discourse. There are other factors, of course, but I would put it to all of us that we're going to make little progress with these issues if we cannot speak to one another across ideological and religious and other forms of difference. So, that brings me to the final question. Is there anything we can do to promote greater civility? And my answer to that is yes, we can. And the first thing that we need to do is to stop talking about civility. Now that sounds maybe a little bit counterintuitive. If civility were a stock, it would be at an all-time high. Pundits and politicians routinely call for greater civility in public discourse. Authors write best-selling and scholarly books about the topic, and universities establish entire institutes to promote civility. Indeed, civility would seem a universally affirming term, one of those warmly persuasive words that seem never to be used unfavorably or to have any positive opposing or distinguishing term. We can all agree, I think, that civility is a general good and it's a condition to which we should aspire in public and private communications. Except we don't. We don't agree on what is meant by civility or whether it's a general good. Conservative critics, for example, have denounced liberal calls for civility as the new censorship, which was a term offered by a caller to the Rush Limbaugh show. Conservative author Mark Levin argues that civility is a, quote, political tool used by those who wish to silence conservative voices. Victor Davis Hanson, who is a classical scholar, descries liberal hypocrisy in appeals for civility, arguing that while the left castigates conservatives for fostering a climate of hate, its own inflammatory rhetoric is unrestrained. And here is Rush Limbaugh talking about civility.
And other states continue, we are no longer getting civility lectures from President Obama or his stenographers in the state-run media. Apparently, a month after Gabrielle Giffords and 18 others were shot in Arizona, it's acceptable for the left to use Twitter to beg for somebody to assassinate Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. It's acceptable for a Wisconsin Democrat assemblyman to point to a Republican assemblywoman in her seat and yell, "You're effing dead," and take 3 days to apologize. It's also acceptable.
Okay, so that's Limbaugh on the hypocrisy of liberals in calling for civility. For their part, many on the political left also distrust civility as a tool for squelching dissent. You may be aware of a controversy that erupted this past summer at the University of Illinois regarding Professor Stephen Salaita. Is anyone familiar with that? Professor Salaita was hired from Virginia Tech to come to Illinois as a tenured professor in their Native American Studies department, and was in the process of moving. He'd resigned from his job and was on his way to Illinois, as I understand it, while at the same time he was tweeting. He's an active Twitter user. He was tweeting comments about Israeli policies in Gaza, and this was during the violence. These tweets were highly inflammatory. The University of Illinois elected, after getting wind of them, to rescind the appointment. In other words, to stop him from coming, and basically to fire him before he was ever hired. One of the reasons given, or the main reason given, was civility and incivility. The board chairman, University of Illinois chairman, Christopher Kennedy, who's the son of the late Robert F. Kennedy, was quoted as saying, "We must constantly reinforce our expectation of a university community that values civility as much as scholarship." Now, that did not go over well with the faculty. Many professors from across the United States have signed a petition. I think the last time I checked, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 to 4,000, promising to boycott the University of Illinois, not to attend conferences or things that may have anything to do with them. The national chapter of the American Association of University Professors released a statement defending Salaita's right to express his views and reiterated its long-standing objection, quote, to using criteria of civility and collegiality in faculty evaluation, as these may represent a threat to academic freedom. Columbia Law University professor Catherine Franke canceled a scheduled appearance at Illinois, but then traveled on her own expense to speak at a rally, and where she argued forcefully against the concept of civility. And we'll hear her remarks very briefly.
Across the country. So let me say one thing emphatically. Whatever else civility may be, it is not an academic norm. Rigor is an academic norm. Making arguments backed by evidence is an academic norm. A willingness to re-examine our settled premises in the service of understanding a problem more fully and more carefully is an academic norm. Civility is not an academic norm. Quite the opposite. Civility undermines the very values we hold dear in the academy.
Okay, so the left doesn't like civility, the right doesn't trust civility, and some people, like myself, think civility is an inadequate metric because it's kind of squishy. You know, it seems to mean play nice. Now, I know it has a historical lineage that's much more substantive than that. But in our present culture, civility doesn't seem to mean much more than let's try to be good to one another, okay? You know, let's not raise our voices. I think what we need, rather than civility, is a different kind of language. A new language, not new, it's not a new language at all, but a language that's more specific, that's more demanding, that's more robust in tempering or in giving us guidance as to how we can debate and argue across profound ideological or cultural differences. And we have that language. It's a very old language. It's a language that most of us practice without really knowing, or we're not explicit in the way that we think of it. And that language is embedded in our arguments, okay? So let me try to pull that out. When we argue, what do? Well, in our courses, we teach students that arguments have, three parts. There's a claim, there's evidence, and then we ask them, look at the counterclaims, look at the counter evidence, subject yourself to the other side, okay? Now, what are we doing when we do that? Well, when we make a claim, we are proposing a relationship with another person, a reader, an audience, with any others. For that relationship to flourish, there has to be a degree of trust on both sides. There has to be a sense that if you tell me something, I can trust that you're speaking without equivocation, without trying to deceive me, without, without telling a lie. And you have to trust that I'm going to listen and take your claim seriously. What do we do in an argument when we provide evidence? Well, when we provide evidence, we make a statement of our own accountability. We don't simply make an assertion, but we provide the wherewithal for you to go back and look at that assertion and examine it and see if, in fact, it holds up. So when we make that argument, we are being accountable, but we're also trusting our audience to reason cogently enough to evaluate that. In other words, we're showing respect to the audience. And what about when we engage in counterarguments? That is when we look at the other side. And as a writing professor, I can tell you, my happiest moments are when students look at arguments that contradict their own and then say, I have to change my own argument because I found evidence that's very powerful on the other side. That's the kind of open-mindedness that we strive for. So what are those things? Respect, tolerance, open-mindedness, accountability, integrity, honesty. There's a name for that. They're what the ancients called virtues. Now the word virtue sounds, sounds very quaint. It's been tainted in contemporary discourse, I think. It's associated with a kind of repressive morality, with the control of women, with certain ideological culture warriors, but those are not the conceptions of virtue I'm thinking about. I'm thinking instead of how moral philosophers define virtue as a character trait, a disposition, a way of living, as Rosalind Hursthouse puts it, that goes all the way down in defining the character of the moral agent. Virtues are those characteristics such as truthfulness and humility, which provide answers to the questions, how should I live my life? And how should I act in this situation? Plato and Aristotle examined the virtues in their writings, and philosophers from Thomas Aquinas to Alistair MacIntyre have explored virtue-based conceptions of ethics. Virtue-based ethics emphasize the character of the individual whose moral choices are guided by habits of mind and heart that help one to live a good life. Now, for our purposes, given our conversation here today, the virtues also offer a set of values to guide our speech and writing. Let's call these rhetorical virtues, the communicative practices that contribute to the moral growth of the individual and not incidentally to the development of a healthy public discourse. To practice rhetorical virtue is to understand that speaking and writing are not merely instrumental, but are fundamentally ethical activities. That means we are obliged to ask certain questions of ourselves before we speak or write. How does our speech or writing reflect, say, the virtues of respectfulness or generosity? How does our writing express the practices of tolerance and fairness? Both the ancient and the Christian traditions recognize the cardinal virtues of practical wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage. To what extent do these and related virtues animate our own words? Such questions move us well beyond vague, largely unrealized hopes for civility. In their place is a more particular and a more demanding set of commitments. The rhetorical virtues require not merely that we persuade or exhort, which are the traditional ends of rhetoric, but that we communicate in a manner consistent with living a moral life. Our arguments become more than vehicles for persuasion. They become scenes of honesty, tolerance, and compassion. Nor does this mean that we alter or sacrifice our convictions. Indeed, we can express these more fully in the knowledge that we are speaking and writing as ethical beings, or at least trying. Now, I'm not so idealistic or deluded as to think that merely naming something a virtue will cure what ails our public language. Simply to name a virtue is not to live it, and what constitutes good judgment or wisdom will always be in dispute. But what the rhetorical virtues offer us is something different. They offer us a language for the assessment and the practice of public discourse. They call upon us to speak and write not as Republicans or liberals, libertarians or Democrats, but as a people committed to an ethical discourse and the common good. They give us a vocabulary to assess that political flyer we receive in the mail, or that shouting match we hear on cable television, or that comparison of George Bush to Hitler or Obamacare to slavery. We can ask of such discourses, ask of ourselves really, Does this program, this speech, this argument, this metaphor, express those values that will encourage a common good? Do we hear in those debates a language of honesty or justice or wisdom? And are we courageous enough to reject those arguments that invite us to indulge in the rhetorical vices of cynicism, mockery, and bitterness? In the end, a better, healthier, more constructive public discourse cannot be legislated. It cannot be accomplished by fiat. Instead, it must be a grassroots effort. It must emerge from our own everyday acts of speaking and writing. Change will not come, if indeed we want change, from our political leaders, from our pundits, or from the spokespersons of our popular culture. It must come instead from us and from the commitments we make. Should we make those commitments, we will be modeling a kind of public language in which our rhetoric speaks more to our character than our opinions. And we will model for one another a way of speaking and writing in which we may argue the most divisive topics, whether of politics, sexuality, or religion, with regard for the worth of those with whom we disagree. Should we learn such lessons and demonstrate them for others as best we can, as often as we can, we may yet become, as the old Roman teacher Quintilian had it, good people speaking well. And that may lead us someday toward a genuinely civil discourse. Thank you very much. Thanks. If there are questions or comments, I'm happy to hear them. Yeah.
I'm very much a partisan, so this is a lament. I voted at 18 in Texas and paid $2 poll tax in order to vote. First time I voted. When Obama was first elected, and I watched the TV in Grant Park, I wept. I was so touched that this country could go from my experience of having to pay $2 to when I was 72 watching on television. And is there not content to back up the fact that this particular, not the past election, but the issue between Obama and the opposition is so disproportionate to other elections or other presidents running that I've experienced? And then this is probably off base, well, this is incendiary, it seems so racist to me. And I find that very sad at this time of my life. I taught high school, I worked in campus ministry, and now I'm working in healthcare. And I don't know where to go with all that. And just one small thing, I sure as heck wish people would, commentators on television would not let people get away with calling the Democratic Party Democrat. They should in turn call it Republic Party. Now that's jabbing. But the other point, do you concur with that? That there is just far more that seemed to mushroom during these past years than previous elections?
Well, if you're asking me as a scholar of rhetoric, I would say that the vitriol directed at President Obama has been extraordinary. But I would also have to say that liberals were not very kind to President Bush either. There was not a racial element, though, so there's a difference there, a substantive difference. I think what I want to focus on is not who is getting treated worse, but rather how do we address the problems that we have. And I think that comes from us making commitments. The kinds of things you're talking about do come from ordinary people, but they also are, I think, rather skillfully stage managed by people who have a lot to gain in inciting outrage. There's a really useful book that's just come out called The Outrage Industry. I forget the names of the authors, but they're political scientists. And they make it very clear that the vitriol, the anger, is carefully stoked to serve certain interests. It depresses voting, it rallies partisans and so forth. And those kinds of things, I think, are the problem that we face. And whether it's coming from them or whether it's coming from our neighbors, I think the question that I want to look at any rate, is how do we address that? So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What is your opinion of the discourse that is on National Public Radio and National Public Television? Do you feel that it is more civil and more, you get a variety of sane opinions?
Try to stay away from the judgmental language. But yeah, I mean, obviously the temperature is turned way, way down on National Public Radio. It's pretty rare. In fact, I've been listening to NPR since over 30 years now. I can't remember a screaming match on NPR. That's not how they do, right? So I think, will you find a greater variety? I think you find a certain kind of discourse on NPR. I don't think there's a great variety on NPR of voices. This is my personal opinion. I think you find kind of middle of the road, moderate discourse on NPR. To me, that's far preferable than listening to two people scream at one another. So that's why I tend to gravitate to that.
I mean, if we could go at least to some moderation in this country, that's better than what we're dealing with now.
I agree completely. I think you're absolutely right. Yes?
Do you think the low voter turnout is directly related to the type of public discourse we have? Are we seeing that as the proliferation of social media goes up, the voter turnout's going down, some people are just shutting it all off?
As I say, cause and effect arguments are complicated, but I think it's a contributing factor, and I think it's a powerful factor. There are other factors. There are voter ID laws, that have the effect of limiting who can vote. There is the kind of general cynicism and apathy that's created not only by public discourse, but by some of the policies that we've adopted in the economic situation of individuals. But I do think that public discourse plays a significant role in driving down voter interest, because there is a sense that it's also futile and that both sides are awful, and why bother? I mean, I think that is the case. Yes.
You said earlier that you were proud how even-handed your presentation was.
Well, I tried. I know.
And no, I'm just asking, do you actually feel that that is a problem in the same amount on the left and on the right? Maybe it is my partisan viewpoint, but it seems to be, particularly in the political realm, and when I look at the Republican Congress, it seems the vitriol and the extremes are more weighted on the Republican side than on the Democratic side, but maybe that's my partisan viewpoint. But
well, there's actually research to support your view. When I speak in a venue like this, I don't want to, unless I'm making it really clear that I'm sharing a general impression that I have. If I make a statement, I want to be sure that it has some basis in some sort of evidence. Now, recently, I've been reading, as I mentioned this book a moment ago, The Outrage Industry, where it's pretty clear that Republicans practice this kind of, what these authors define as outrage discourse, practice it more frequently and a bit more hyperbolically, and that's a euphemism. They practice it. So your perceptions are backed by research. And so I would say that I agree with that. I've long felt that, but I wanted to see some evidence before I made that claim in a public setting. Yes?
Evangelism, which deals with irrefutable truth, has been part of the fabric of America from the very beginning, New England in the 16th, 17th century.
Yeah.
Going right down through the Middle West, come through, and now it's everywhere. I wondered, is the rise of the right talk post commentary movement, which has been a very effective political weapon for the Republicans, can that be seen as yet another manifestation of the sort of tradition of evangelism in the United States?
That's an interesting question. You're asking whether the rise of talk radio has its roots in or is in some way influenced by evangelical discourses?
It's something that seems to be essential to American culture. It's part of the component to have evangelism. And it's now the politicians have grabbed onto this. And some of the proponents truly believe, and others are using it as an effective weapon, but it involves passion, it involves making money, it involves entertainment, all the things that have been part of evangelism throughout our history. I wonder if this is just another stage of evangelism in the United States.
That's a great insight. I'm not sure. I mean, I think, I think it must contribute. And lots of people have written about the alliance. The alliance is sometimes difficult within the Republican Party of the evangelical wing, the business wing, social conservative wing, and so forth. So I'm sure that they're influencing one another. I'm not exactly sure how. On the other side, you have the Southern Baptist tradition coming out of the black churches, and that rhetoric, which has animated some of the more powerful figures associated with the American left. And I'm thinking, I'm sure you know, Martin Luther King specifically, but also Jesse Jackson and Barack Obama. I think some of his early campaign speeches are in that style that Southern Baptist preaching style. He governs differently, but as a candidate, he calls upon all those rhetorical resources. So I think you're probably right. They probably do animate one another. Yes?
I was wondering if you could comment on recent election and the proliferation of attack ads. And, you know, whenever polls are done, my understanding is the vast majority of Americans are against them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, whenever they do polls, they find it very successful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is the paradoxical. This is along with a line of paradoxical statements. Our congressional approval rating, last time I checked, was about 14%. You know, so we're not big fans of Congress, and yet it's almost impossible to defeat a sitting congressperson. We all claim to hate attack ads, but we respond to them. The people who make these ads are spending a lot of money, and they're not stupid. They are studying how we react to these kinds of things. So we say we don't like them, but we clearly are being motivated by them. In the same way that most of us, I think, most of us will say that commercials are inane and ridiculous, and we don't make any sense. Somebody else might be influenced, but I'm not buying Charmin because of the squeezable stuff. You know, but I'm never, right? So we are manipulated by these things. When I was talking about the origins of our political, our discourse, some Democrats will take it back to 1988 and the presidential campaign of Bush versus Dukakis and the use of Willie Horton in a campaign ad in which Horton, who was, I don't know, you probably don't remember this, he was a murderer, a convicted murderer, who was furloughed in Massachusetts. Dukakis had nothing to do with it, but he was furloughed, and while he was out on furlough, he kidnapped a couple, tortured, and raped. And that ad was used against Dukakis to paint him as weak on crime. Democrats will point to that as, say, this was the beginning of the attack ads, and we're just trying, it's an arms race at this point. Now, Republicans will go back and say, yeah, well, what about the Daisy ad when Goldwater was running for president, where there was a nuclear explosion? You know, so, I mean, this is where you get into the back and forth. I'm not sure how productive it is. The bigger issue that you raised, though, is do we respond to these things? It seems to me that we do. We do, even though we say we won't. And if I could put in a plug for rhetorical virtue, that's where we need to exercise judgment and wisdom when we encounter these things and ask what are we being invited to feel? What are we being summoned to become when we are addressed by that kind of rhetoric? You know, people think of rhetoric as persuasion. I think of rhetoric as invitation. Rhetoric is an invitation to you and me to become a certain kind of individual, to act in a certain way, to feel in a certain way. No one forces us to, but we're invited by the discourse to become one with that discourse and to adopt its ideals and its values and its emotions. That's where we need to be. We need to exercise judgment and wisdom. Those things that Aristotle wrote about a long, long, long time ago, and that people are still writing about today. Yes?
Professor, do you have any comment about the appropriateness of the MIT professor, Jonathan Gruber, who said American voters were too stupid to understand Obamacare?
I don't really have a comment. I've only seen the headlines. I haven't read any of the stories. It doesn't sound like a very good idea to say those things.
The way people actually feel that are in Washington?
I don't know, sir. I honestly don't know. The surprise to me was that it wasn't on Twitter, because that seems to be the place where you go to make incredibly stupid statements that you have to retract later on. You apparently made it at a public venue. So, you know, he's old-fashioned that way, I guess. I take your point. I take your point. I don't believe you.
There's been quite a bit about it in the Wall Street Journal.
Yes.
If attack ads are so motivational, why is the voter turnout so low?
Yeah.
That seems to be contradictory.
Well, what are they motivating? You know, they're motivating some of us to get up and go vote and be angry. They're motivating more of us to withdraw and to say, and to be so disgusted by the whole process. When you have two people doing this back to back, both sides, they're motivating people to withdraw from political participation. And I believe, and this is a belief, but to make it clear, I believe that's the purpose. That's one of the purposes that
is to have lower turnout?
To depress turnout, yeah. I believe that's one of the purposes.
If you listen to them, they are stimulating people with argumentation to go and vote in a particular way.
Certain kinds of people respond to them. Other people respond by withdrawing from the process. Some people respond by saying, yeah, this is unbelievable. I'm going to go make phone calls on behalf of the candidate. I'm going to donate money. And they reach that percentage of the electorate who's actually voting. But the rest of us, it seems, respond differently, which is to say a pox on both your houses. I've got better things to do than to listen to this stuff.
Listen, yes. Vote, no.
Incendiary comments aside, is there empirical evidence that there is more inaccuracy and more misinformation now in the public discourse compared to older times?
I think that's a good question. I don't know of anyone who's doing a comparative study. Okay? I know that people are studying, you know, the modern period, what's happened, say, since the 1960s. But I don't know of people who have done comparative studies. Now, there are scholars, historians, who studied the 17th century, the 18th century, the rhetoric of the 18th century. Some of the things that were written in, you know, the broadsides of the colonial period, you know, make your hair stand up. Oh, wow. But I don't know if anyone's done a comparative study. Sorry.
One more question. Nothing like inviting the last question.
Do you think that maybe with a coming election, the pushing of immigration with, you know, if it's going to pass or it's going to be something done about, that Obama is attracting a group of people that never participated in voting to say that he's going to maintain his party ahead of the other one? Because majority of them, they don't come out anyway to vote, even if amnesty is not going to be offered, or any other issues with not only across the border, it's across the globe. You know, everybody moving from here to there and everywhere.
Yeah. Well, whenever you meet, it seems to me, now I'm not a political scientist, so I'm a little bit out of my area here, but it seems to me whenever you meet an optimistic Democrat, they want to talk about demography. They want to talk about the change in the electorate, the American electorate. The angry white voter seems to be a shrinking, you know, group of people. And immigration, demographic change, these voters seem to be aligning themselves more with Democrats. Smart Republicans are thinking about how do we reverse that trend? What do we need to do to appeal to these people? And whether that happens, how it happens, if it happens, remains to be seen. But I think your question is exactly on point. So I guess that's the last question. Thank you so much for coming, and go Irish.